Now allow me to digress and talk about the depth of field and anamorphic lenses. For me, the way the light gets distorted and scattered while passing through our virtual lens is an integral part of the whole lighting setup, and it's definitely an important part of our cinematography. So let's get into the camera settings while having the camera selected and activate the depth of field. Right away we can see that our camera focused on a certain point, and we can shift this point with the help of the distance slider. It works just like the focus ring on the lens. It works in a really physically plausible way because that's a path tracing render engine. And to not guess the distance, it's always easier to have a focus object somewhere in the scene, like this empty object here. The easy way to place one is to shift and right click to place a 3D cursor somewhere, then shift A and spawn an empty object. But I'll get rid of it because we already have one. Let's use it. It's called focus. So I'm clicking on the camera border to select it. Then down within the depth of field settings, I'm clicking on the eyedropper and selecting our focus empty. As for the lens aperture settings, we have the f-stop parameter that controls how closed or open is our aperture. The higher values produce the extended depth of field, very wide depth of field, and on the contrary, the lower values like 2.8 or even lower like 1.4 produce a very narrow depth of field, where a tiny portion of 3D depth is in focus and everything else is devoured by a creamy bokeh. We can fine-tune the bokeh shape by adjusting the number of the aperture blades. We will see the effect in just a moment. And also adjusting the anamorphic ratio, where 1 is a perfectly spherical lens and 2 is a lens with an anamorphic squeeze. I'm gonna go with 1.6 for a balanced, slightly anamorphic look. The way that the anamorphic lenses work, aside from squeezing the out of focus elements, is that it leads to a widescreen aspect ratio, like 2.5 to 1, like 1920 by 816 pixels. Let's run a quick comparison now. Here is a perfectly spherical lens with the aperture ratio of 0 and the 8 blades aperture. Here we've bumped the aperture ratio to 2, meaning an anamorphic lens. It's still got a retro 8 blades aperture look. If it's an anamorphic lens, it should probably have a widescreen aspect ratio, to keep it historically accurate. And this pairing of the lens and the aspect ratio just looks cinematic. And finally, it should probably feature an anamorphic flare, but we won't go that direction yet.